So, um, welcome everyone. I'm Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders, and welcome to our occasional series of webinars. In this case, we are convening our science communications webinar this week. It's a busy time for us in this area of work because not only are we convening today's discussion on how science can improve our understanding of misinformation, we're also going to be having another webinar next week in the same series on training, science communications training too. So stay tuned for that as well. We've got a great panel to discuss the topic today. Just as a quick note of logistics, for those of you attending this webinar, if you want to ask a question, there's a Q&A function there on your screen. We'll be keeping an eye on the participant questions along the way. And we're really going to make this a conversation among experts. And we know that we have a lot of expertise among the participants and not just the speakers and presenters of this call too. So just to give a little bit of context of what we're doing here today, over the past year or so, we've had a number of programs, webinars, in-person programming, etc., where we have been focusing on communicating science and the science of communications, and in particular, building on a meeting about this time last year at the National Academy of Sciences. We had identified sort of 4 areas of concern for funders who are interested in this topic, and that is to better define and develop evaluation and measurement strategies, the use of popular culture, art, and creative spaces and other ways of communicating with new and diverse audiences, as well as understanding audiences and tailoring messages and frames accordingly. We also are focusing on building connections between research and practice. And so that's really where we are in today's program and to some extent on next week's program on the 19th as well, the connection between research and practice. And we've got great researchers here with us, Brian Southwell from RTI International, as well as Soroush Vosugi, who's recently been appointed to Dartmouth University and will be joining that faculty as well. And as our able guide in a lot of these conversations among funders, Elizabeth Christopherson is president of the Rita Allen Foundation, and she's been working closely and very concerned about these issues. And she helped to convene a really interesting discussion for funders last month in Washington at the Aspen Institute, where we had a great discussion, a funders breakfast at the Misinformation Solutions Forum, which was a collaboration of Rita Allen, RTI International, and Aspen Institute at the Aspen Institute. And so building on that discussion, I wanted to invite Elizabeth to say a little bit about framing our discussion today, and we'll carry on from there. So thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us once again.
Great. Thank you, Vince. And thank you very much for the work that you and Media Impact Funders are doing to really create opportunities for funders to come together and others in the field to talk about key topics, and particularly to hear from experts such as Soroush and Brian today, and Brooke and others on Monday around these topics. We wear many hats. I'm also very pleased that I'm a part of the Media Impact Funder community, which has really had a robust and evolving program of opportunities for funders, Vince, and so much thanks again to you and your team, Roshni here, who's also helping us with this. But you asked me to give a little bit of a context, I think, for how and why we led to the Misinformation Solutions Forum and became interested in this topic. And so Roshni's going to add a slide, and we're going to give a little brief context for how we evolved with this work. So first a note about the Rita Allen Foundation, because almost a half a century ago, we began investing in outstanding leaders, biomedical scientists, who are really devoted to finding new evidence and knowledge to benefit humanity. And more recently, in the last decade, when we opened our first office and our portfolio expanded, we became very interested in the ecosystem around scientists, particularly how we think of media's role, communication, and civic engagement. We have always been investing in, I think, in ideas at their earliest stages. We've been asking what if, and we seek to be deeply collaborative, community-centric, and also very inclusive. So some of our early efforts to find out more in the research area evolved out of work that Kathleen Hull Jameson had been doing. She had been, of course, looking at the political rhetoric and what was happening in that space, and then evolved over to include a science lens. And she decided to create a handbook around the science of science communication. In other words, what's evidence-based? And I know, Brian, you were asked to author a chapter, as we were too, and to take a look at what philanthropy was doing to use evidence in terms of its communication also. And from that, we also invested with Climate Central in a National Academy of Sciences report that was, again, looking across disciplines about what we actually know that might be effective in communicating science. That wasn't really a seminal report, and highlighted some of the key areas that Vince just talked about, especially the gap between research and practice. We invested in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and their public Face of Science report. They've done one segment of that. It's a 3-year plan. The Aspen Institute and others such as Science Counts and projects that involving many other funders who care deeply about the space. But I really like to come back to the importance of connecting research and practice, because it was at last year's Sackler colloquium, which came out of the report of the National Academy of Sciences, that highlighted that there was a gap between all this great social science research, behavioral science, and others, that we needed to connect better with practitioners. So we created an open call then, and Brendan Nyan, who was one of the recipients of the award, working with the Department of Health in Vermont around connecting people better around messages around vaccinations, made a comment that he had always been thinking about connecting with some practitioners, but it wasn't until this open call that he really felt he had been nudged to move forward and create a new project, an initiative that would help people better understand things. So at the same time that we were looking with a number of other partners, Media Impact Forum was doing some webinars, was creating some forums, and actually it was serendipity that Brian Southwell and I were on the same stage together. And of course, as I think the one of the key senior folks from Ruth Katz from the Aspen Institute says, once you start a conversation with Brian, you probably will have a project or something else will come out of it. So Brian and I had a number of conversations talking about what if we were going to design another open call, because at that time there was not another Sackler planned. What if we were going to then create a new space that would be a forum that would be designed not as a showcase for a finalist or a winner, but rather as a workshop or a lab for people from different disciplines, from media, funders, social scientists, behavioral scientists, could come together and have an opportunity to really discuss and strengthen some of the proposals, because we know that this is the complex area. We need a lot of iteration and we need a lot of diverse perspectives. So that's really how that began. And we are, again, delighted to be working with a number of other funders in this emerging field. I think it was Kelly Bourne from Hewlett, who really initiated a 3-part series with the Democracy Fund, and Rita Allen. And I think that gives a little bit of the sense of our work and how we, again, are extremely interested in learning, adapting, and iterating, and supporting some tremendous experts such as Brian Southwell and Sarush, who we often quote. I was just teasing him and asking him if it was about a zillion times that he's been referenced for his work, because it is such a so important to be evidence-based as we're even talking about such a key topic as this information. So thanks, Vince.
Great. Thanks very much, Elizabeth, for your leadership and for sharing your perspective with us today. We did, I think, really, we've heard about Surush's work for some time, but recently became acquainted with it in paying attention to the Smash gathering at WGBH a month or two ago. It was a really interesting gathering. We'll share the links to talks for on the chat function here as well. But we heard a brief presentation by the co-author of a recent article, Deb Roy, which was, if people want to dig in a little further, listening to that would be interesting as well. But we have the principal author with us to share his perspective on this work as well. It seems like every day we're seeing another aspect of how the major platforms, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or WhatsApp or the major players, are having an impact on our democratic processes, and it's quite problematic in some cases. I mean, just today's news of some of the behavior at Facebook has been quite chilling in some ways. But I think the report that you prepared, Sarush, in Science magazine was really a long view, and one that I think it's really important for us to share with our network and sort of unpack that. So I wonder if you could maybe take us through your process and share with us your perspective about that article.
Sure, sure. Thanks for having me. The article that we published in Science in March of this year started with a simple question. We were interested in seeing whether there is a difference between how false and true information spreads on social media. And we were in a unique position to study this problem because our lab at the MIT Media Lab, which was headed by, or is headed by Deb Roy, had unprecedented access to Twitter historical archives. We had a special data deal with Twitter where they gave us access to every single tweet ever posted on Twitter, going back to 2006 when Twitter was started. And so using our access to this data set and also our expertise in data mining, we were able to collect hundreds of thousands of examples of fact-check stories that spread on Twitter from 2008 all the way to the end of 2016. And so when I say fact-checked, I mean these are stories that at some point were contested, the veracity of the stories were contested, and so an independent fact-checking organization like Snopes or PolitiFact, for instance, checked the stories and gave it a veracity score. And so looking at these examples, hundreds of thousands of examples, we were able to see if there is a difference between how they spread, how the stories that were rated false by these fact-checking organizations spread versus the ones that were rated true. And what we saw is that there is indeed a difference between how they spread. And in general, it seems like false stories outperform true stories. And I have a video here to share to just kind of highlight the difference. Let me see if I can get this to work. So there we go. So as you can see here, we have two example cascades, one shown in blue and one shown in red. The red one shows, this is from actual data, and I'm going to replay it for you. So the red one shows an actual false story spreading on Twitter, and the blue nodes show an actual true story spreading on Twitter at around the same time. And each node in this graph represents a retweet. So at the center, you see, like at the beginning, at the center of these cascades, you see the original tweet, and everything is a retweet of that tweet. And we picked this example because it's a bit exaggerated, but you can actually clearly see the difference between the two cascades. The red cascade, which is an example false cascade, is much more massive, much deeper, meaning that it's jumping through many hops on social media. It's reaching more people, and you can't see time here, but it's also spreading faster. And again, this is an exaggerated example, real data, but one that really shows the difference. Overall, not all the cascades, not all the false and true cascades look like this, but I think this makes a point that there is indeed the difference between how false and true information spreads, and that false information outperforms or beats true information. And let me stop this. There we go. And so once we showed that there is indeed a difference between the two and that false information outperforms true information, we were interested in understanding why that is. And the first thought we had was maybe bots are the reason why false information spreads faster than true information. We did look at, we had a state-of-the-art bot detection algorithm, and we did look at the effect of bots on our analysis. And we did find that indeed bot accounts do accelerate the spread of information, but they seem to do so at somewhat an equal rate actually between false and true information. And if you take all the bots from our data, the differences between the false and true, between how false and true information spreads still stands. And so bots couldn't be the reason why. And so we theorize that there might be psychological reasons as to why people are more likely to spread misinformation. And this part of our analysis, it's not as strong as the other parts of our analysis because this was an observational study, so we weren't able to run any experiments. But what we could do with our data set was look at how people responded to false information versus true information. And we saw that people tend to respond more with anger and fear to false information compared to true information. And that false information seems to be, in general, more novel. So if you look at what people are exposed to on a daily basis, and compare the false stories that they're being exposed to the background stories that they're being exposed to, we see that false stories just tend to be more novel, and that people have a more visceral reaction to it. And so from that, again, this is not a causal analysis, but at least the correlations show that false information seems to be more novel, more juicy, if you want to call it like that, and that it seems to cause a more visceral reaction in people. And previous research has shown that when people read an article that they have a visceral reaction to, they're more likely to share that article. And so we think there's a similar phenomenon happening here. Definitely further studies are needed to look at these psychological factors and see if it is indeed true that people are more likely to spread false information because of psychological reasons. That's a very clear area of research for the future that needs to be looked at. But also, our study was completely observational, and I think the next step would be to actually run experiments to see if if our findings are actually true experimentally as well, and if so, are there any strategies we could deploy to dampen the spread of misinformation? But I guess we'll be talking about that later on during this webinar. Thank you.
I wonder if we could just follow up with a brief question, observation. I know that for us, when we're talking in our programming around the science of communications, understanding what works, what's effective, what reaches people. We've had some great presentations by, for example, the team at University of Florida. It's a special program on public interest communications, and they make the very strong point that it's not just enough to sort of deliver your factual argument, but you actually have to make it emotionally appealing and engaging. And in a sense, I think we can infer from what you're describing here is the false items are more emotionally engaging. And so at some level, maybe an active, for funders and nonprofit communicators to really be thinking, okay, what is the more shareable nugget? How can I make my factual statements more intriguing and shareable that may not be scalable in the way that you're talking, but I wonder if you thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're saying is correct, which is it seems like false news is just more emotionally engaging. And there's been a lot of research that shows that emotionally engaging information is spread faster and more than information that's not as emotionally engaging. So in a sense, our research actually falls under that category of work it just happens that false news is more engaging. And it's not surprising, because if you're someone who's producing false news articles, you basically have unlimited, you can write anything you want. You're not fixed to reality, right? So you don't have to adhere to any facts or anything. So you can make your story as interesting as possible and as emotionally engaging as possible. Whereas if you're reporting true stories, there's a limit as to how much you can change what you're writing to make it more emotionally interesting. But there's definitely some room to play. And I think one really interesting area of research is tools that would allow people who are writing an article, let's say a journalist who's writing an article, it's kind of like think of it as a text editor for journalists that would suggest rephrasing certain things to keep the factual information the same, but make it more emotionally engaging. And I think that's definitely something that could be built now. There's so much information out there. There's so much data out there that one can use to train a tool like that would be able to suggest rephrasing of certain sentences to make it more emotionally engaging. And it would be interesting if we actually had some kind of metric saying that if you switch this sentence with this other sentence, the veracity of the statement stays the same, becomes more emotionally engaging, and it will probably lead to 4 more retweets, for instance, right? I think that would be something very useful to fight the misinformation war.
That's great. That's great. And is that guidance that you have initiated in any way beyond what you're just speaking to us now? Is it already presented to someone?
It hasn't been presented. It's actually an active project that I'm working on currently, which I call it a journalist IDE. And an IDE is, if you're a programmer, you use a tool that lets you rapidly write programs. It gives you suggestions as you're writing. It's called an IDE, in interactive development environment. And so something like that for journalists, where as they're writing their stories, it would quickly suggest rephrasing of certain sentences. It'll be deep learning based, so basically trained on millions of examples of messages that we've seen spread on Twitter, and kind of try to understand the emotion, like what was it that made it spread. Keep making sure that it's not because it's false, so keeping the veracity the same, and then changing the emotional phrasing to make it more engaging.
That's super. Well, keep us informed if you can share with us as you develop that, and particularly if you see uptake among any of the major platforms, and for that matter, perhaps we can be influential in urging publishers to take this on too. I think what's interesting about this part of our dialogue is we have tended in our past discussions of misinformation to think of it as how do we suppress the misinformation, how do we interrupt the bad information? But part of the equation is also how do we make more appealing factual and true information. So thank you so much for working on that as well. I think you'll see everyone who's participating, we're sharing some of the links to the science article and to our past webinars on the topics. So feel free to click through on those links after the call, folks. I also want you all to encourage you to be thinking about questions for Soroush and others as well. We'll try and get to them as soon as we see them. But I think we can maybe transition now to the next part of the conversation. And so Brian Southwell has been working on so many different aspects of this. I think most recently he has a book out, Misinformation and Mass Audiences. Is that the most recent product, Brian?
Yep, out this year. Yep, that's right.
Out this year. Great. And so thank you for doing that work. And we were really pleased to have you with us at our Media Impact Forum in 2017, I believe it was, in Washington, as well as encountering you just last month in Washington at the Aspen Institute as well. an exciting time hearing from you because you have new news from the forum as well. But just to give a little bit more context for people, in addition to Brian's work at RTI International, he also teaches at UNC and Duke. For those of you who are wondering, what is RTI International? It was originally Research Triangle Institute, I believe. And so that's where the RT comes from. And that's where Brian is. So Brian, why don't you share with us the exciting news you have and tell us a little bit more about the context of the work at the forum.
Great, thanks so much, Vince, and thank you for these efforts to bring together conversations like this. Before I jump into that, I actually offer just a word with regards to the effort that Elizabeth Christopherson has put into not only putting the forum together, but also continuing conversations like this. And part of the reason that I've got involved into this conversation is because of the approach that Media Impact Funders takes, and that also Rita Allen Foundation takes. So often the challenges that we're trying to address are ones that invite new innovation, but they also, the way that we tend to fund work, the way that we tend to compete for various aspects of notoriety, it tends to encourage proprietary stances on things, and for folks to kind of carve out turf and to do work and stick in their own corner. And we need a different approach, I think, in order to really make progress here. So part of the thought with the Misinformation Solutions Forum was that perhaps we could invite more of an open source approach, that we could invite people to work together and collaborate in a real and meaningful way, not just put lip service to that, but rather to try to do interdisciplinary work, work that was not only interdisciplinary in terms of drawing from different academic disciplines, but also multi-sectorial work that was actually going to invite in folks that were working in professional capacities in different organizations, with university researchers, with others who might have ideas here. And so that's been very much part of the approach all along. And I'm happy to report that we've made great progress in that. We've had some really good discussions, and we've conducted a nationwide search for ideas that I'll talk about here in just a minute. But also important to the Misinformation Solutions Forum was this recognition that with regards to misinformation, perhaps part of the problem really involves all of us, involves us on the phone and the webinar right now, and it involves individual consumers. Yes, there are external agents that we might think about here as proliferating, disseminating false information, but part of the issue, part of the concern is the fact that we tend to share information between one another. We are attracted to and drawn in by certain types of information framed in particular ways, emotionally evocative information, some of the ideas we just talked about a moment ago. And so part of the thought is that maybe part of the solution would involve actually addressing the individuals who tend to share information once posted. Now, there are a couple of different ways you can do that, and one would be in a way that just told people not to do it, essentially, and attempted to try to ban or suppress information. But one of the through lines that we found in all of the submissions, or many of the submissions anyway, and in the finalists and the projects I'll talk about here in a minute, is a position and a stance of respect for the audience and for individuals, respect for our humanity, and respect for the fact that folks aren't necessarily always out there maliciously trying to cause ill will, but some of the spread of misinformation happens inadvertently. Some of it happens maybe despite intention or for other reasons than just cheering on inaccuracy. And so what we've gone through is a process. This is one that has involved a number of different organizations, and we've had reference to that already. Elizabeth at Rita Allen Foundation has really been core here in terms of making this possible. We had the pleasure of being able to conduct the forum at the Aspen Institute, and in addition to that, there also have been other funders involved at an initial stage. Folks like Democracy Fund and Bros Welcome Fund and Craig Newmark Philanthropies as well. And so we put out a call and got a really robust response of roughly 80 submissions. And we were surprised at that, partly because our bar was fairly high. We suggested that what we wanted were real solutions that weren't just pie in the sky ideas, but these are ideas that were potentially scalable, but also were going to be easily implemented. That these are ideas that could be developed, that was feasible, that the team that you put together could actually develop this idea, and that you think you'd have real traction with this notion. Despite that, we had roughly 80 qualifying submissions that were then sent out for pretty rigorous peer review with a really a wonderful group of judges from different institutions representing a lot of different sectors. And I really am pleased at the thoughtfulness that went into reviewing these. Out of that came a set of 5 finalists, six finalists that we were able to bring together. And part of our criterion was teams that not only were doing work that was potentially feasible and scalable, but also teams that seemed open to critique, teams that seemed open to collaboration. And we brought folks together to the Aspen Institute for a full day experience, one that by all accounts was invigorating, but also exhausting for everybody involved, including the finalists. Because what we did was have the finalists briefly present their ideas and then lay bare some of the thinking and rationale and assumptions on the table, and then through a series of sessions throughout the day, with people rotating in and out of different sessions, have really deep dive in conversations about feasibility, about the likelihood, about raising stumbling blocks, and there was opportunity for iterative thinking and for the ideas to kind of be developed further. We're not done yet. I'm about to announce that we have 3 awards from this. But what we've established is a network and a community that I think is going to be the basis for a lot of ongoing collaboration and continued discussion. Our expectation is that each of these awardees is going to continue on with work indefinitely, but we also are hopeful that folks who were part of the forum are going to be part of collaborative efforts as well. We've already heard for a number of ideas for additional efforts. And even the top tier of submissions, folks that didn't make it to the forum, there are ideas and possibilities for collaboration there as well. So just to give you a brief flavor of the ideas, I believe that Roshni can post the link to the announcement as it's gone out late last night, and it's available this morning at rti.org/announcements. And we have 3 projects highlighted there. And what I think is noteworthy about these projects, not only the spirit of what they're trying to do, but also the types of institutions that are involved. So the 3 teams, and I'll just briefly mention those by virtue of the lead organization, because these were collaborative efforts. The 3 were first a project called Mind Over Chatter, and this was submitted by a team at Indiana University Kokomo. Indiana University Kokomo is noteworthy partly because they are a regional campus of Indiana University. They are a campus that is allowing for access to and service to a diverse range of students. And if we think about increased efforts to work with community colleges, work with regional campuses, and this is an effort to do that. The Indiana University Kokomo effort is going to encourage and use a training module and an effort to engage students in mindfulness, which might not seem connected to misinformation. But their thought is that by encouraging mindfulness, that this is going to be key and central to discouraging the kind of quick judgment and rapid dissemination of false information that we see happen sometimes on social media. There's a lot to their team. It's a truly interdisciplinary team, but it's also a team that involves the university campus in a community way. And what I mean by that is that they actually have the highest levels of university administration as part of the team, in addition to a number of different disciplinary areas. And so it's a great project. We also have public media in our group of finalists. KQED out in San Francisco has a project called Go Above the Noise. This is building on some of their existing work right now in efforts to engage teens and adolescents with a novel approach to help people navigate and make sense of the media environment. It's a fast-paced environment now. Teens are savvy in lots of ways, but there are ways that they could be encouraged to help make better judgments about the credibility of information and about what they ought to share on social media and other places. So there's a series that KQED is developing, and they're going to be continuing to do that with some additional support. The third effort is one developed out at Washington State University, again in conjunction with a group of collaborators, on a project called Let Me Fact Check That For You. And the basic idea is that they are making it possible and laying bare and affording transparency to the kind of person-to-person fact-checking effort that sometimes goes on the rumor dismissal effort that happens with something like Snopes.com, for example. They have made it possible for people to essentially illustrate and to show in easily shareable ways how it is that information might be false. It's quite clever what they've done, and it involves a fair amount of coding work. So they have a partner there that has developed applications that I think have a lot of possibility. So again, what's really central to all of these projects is a recognition that individual consumers are information consumers are part of the equation, but we can't just shame people and tell them not to do this. We need to provide tools, we need to provide literacy tools, and also provide encouragement for ways for them to value the type of accurate information that Vince and others just mentioned, and that maybe we can meet them part way in presenting information in digestible and emotionally evocative ways. So as I mentioned before, we don't view this as a finished product. We actually view this as the beginning of a longer-term conversation. So Roshni is also going to share with you an opportunity to be part of a mailing list that's part of the forum. And we have also, for those of you that are interested in what happened at the forum, we've been able to feature this recently on a public radio show here in the North Carolina area, and so we can send a link to that episode as well. So, but there's a lot more we can talk about, there. But again, thank you so much to Elizabeth and those that supported the effort, Vince, for your support for this as well.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think the participants on this discussion can appreciate why we were so eager to get to this discussion today, to be really a part of the exciting moment, just-in-time delivery of these announcements of the winning presenters. And for those of us, Elizabeth and I were there that day. It's really something to share with you all. A little bit of a feeling of the process of that day. It was, I think, just as a matter of how do we do this work? How do we support it? How do we encourage it? To get maybe a feeling for the nature of the dialogue, maybe to invite you to elaborate on that a little bit. I'll just say, from my part, I had the opportunity to participate in a review session with the WQED crew who did Go Above the Noise. And it was fascinating not just to unpack the project, but also to see the level of expertise around the table and that kind of dynamic of improving the project while reviewing the project. And maybe you could say a little bit about how you designed that and how you executed that.
Thank you so much for that. So, those of you, many people on the phone are quite familiar with grant submission processes and the processes for peer review for journals, and there's a lot of value in those processes. But there's also a tendency sometimes for critique, and without necessarily a sense of the iteration and the response, in real time with those that are submitting. There's also a tendency, I think, for inviting folks to submit and defend and to pitch their idea in a way that suggests it's ironclad and there's no faults in it. And we had to build a safe space, I think, for folks to be able to admit and acknowledge potential weakness in their idea, and yet still be credible to be at the table with an idea to defend. And so how do you balance that? And partly it's a matter of inviting in, I think, a great group of moderators for some of those discussions, which we did. And we had folks that many of the folks, and I think this is a nice move on that worked out well, had journalism backgrounds, for example, were good at asking questions, who didn't necessarily have content expertise in this arena, but who were able to facilitate some of those discussions. So you didn't just have reviewer and critic and team, but rather also a moderated discussion. We also encouraged people to lay bare their own sense of what some of the weaknesses were and to use this as an opportunity. So part of the prize for all of the finalist teams was being there for the day, was actually a chance to get this kind of feedback from really smart folks, folks that are aware of this, and also with an eye towards thinking concretely, how does this exist outside of an ivory tower moment where you sort of put a paper together, but rather in a sustainable way? What can we talk about in terms of funding possibilities, in terms of the possibility for expanding this, and to think about real marketplaces of information as well. And so one of the things I had almost universally, all of the finalist teams, and I'm happy to report this, were very thankful at the end of the day. I think at the early part of the day, there was some sense of having hackles up a little bit because the ideas were taken apart, critiqued, and it was hard because they had flown there and made a case for their idea. And here in the first hour, we were saying, all right, now let's pick it apart. And that was something that I'm glad that we actually had the full day, because I think people got into the groove of recognizing that we're kind of collaboratively developing this rather than just hearing a half-minute or a half-hour critique and then having to go home. And so we had this time set and real time for discussion, and then we were able to come back and talk about this. We also had people agree going in that there was going to be some possibility for invitation for collaboration, but also this open source approach was something that we really took seriously. But that meant that you're going to come in and talk about your idea in a way that others could be inspired by that idea and could go off and do something similar, or could contact you for collaboration. And I think all of our finalists bought in. That mattered quite a bit as well. So so that, I don't know, it was a really gratifying experience. Elizabeth might have some thoughts on that as well, and Vince too, is in terms of thinking about designing these types of spaces. But I don't know, Elizabeth, is there anything you wanted to add to that? And we'll get Elizabeth off of the mute here, probably. Yeah, or Ashni, if you want to do that.
There we did. Thank you, Brian. I think you did a great description. I think there are two other things that I might add. I think in thinking about how to be very inclusive, wanted to thank you and Brian, and thank you and Vanessa and our team too for reaching out to grad students. I think thinking about the future leadership as well as different perspectives, people who are particularly using social media, was extremely important to have them in the room with us. So I think that was important. And then hearing, this may be of interest to people who are on the call, one of the key questions, not surprisingly, with funders in the room, was to unlock and unpack the mystery of how to interact better with funders to gain support, especially since you had a group of funders there who are also participating in both listening and asking questions and so forth. So I think that's an opportunity, I think, to create sometimes some different spaces and dialogue, and hopefully that was a helpful dialogue to have people like Vince and other funders, Democracy Fund and so forth, at the table to really be talking about how to build something without all the answers.
Yeah, so thank you, Elizabeth. There's two things you raised, a lot that you raised that's really worth pointing to, but two things I want to just even further emphasize. One, you mentioned my colleague, Vanessa Bodwin, said she was invaluable to this. She works with me here at RTI and really was central, and she was a really key and important part. The second, though, are these graduate student fellows. We had a dozen of them in. And I'm happy to report to folks on the phone that I think the future's in good hands. We've got a lot of folks that were really dynamic and energetic. However, they also learned so much from doing work outside of academic spaces in this forum. That was something that was really invaluable, because they're thinking about this in sometimes more theoretical ways, in terms of more abstract ways, and to think in practical means how you would actually build collaborative teams, work with community groups, work with journalistic entities, work with the social media platforms. That was really practical and helpful discussion, and all of them have also been really appreciative, and they learned quite a bit. We were we were working with them and invited them to be our partners in both taking notes and also interpreting some of those sessions, and they've done a great job with that. And I'm actually also happy to report that the graduate student fellows will be part of a proceedings document that a publication that we'll have out soon, that's going to give all 6 of the finalists essays, as well as feedback, and the graduate student fellows working in pairs wrote reflective essays on each of those approaches. And we'll be putting all of that out as well through our independent peer-reviewed press, RTI Press. So be looking for that soon.
Great. So just a couple of encouragement for both the panelists, but also the participants. For participants, we know there's expertise. You're not on screen, so everyone else can't see you, but we can see you, and we know that you have expertise and questions. So I know that Brooke Smith is out there, and Sally Lehrman at the Trust Project. Surely you must have some questions. we had a question. It was really more of a comment from Ann Zeisser. And also, I just want to invite our panelists to think about a question for each other if you have them along the lines of the discussion we just had there, if you want to ask each other a question. But I did just want to acknowledge Ann Zeisser had made a comment, and I don't know if everyone could see it, but I'll just read it out, that going back, I think, to the conversation we were having with Sarush, that it's important to note that there are folks who are professional communicators who develop social media campaigns and other public information campaigns who know how to make sound science and other factual information more emotionally engaging, but that it's not a new arena, but maybe newer for some of the scientists and researchers. So we do recognize, I think, that there is a level of practice that's already underway, but I think making sure that everybody is as effective as some of our leading practitioners, it's important to acknowledge that. So panelists, any questions for each other?
I had one. I'm a big fan of Shrush's work, and again, thank you for being here, part of this panel. It's a point that came up earlier in the discussion. I'm wondering, absolutely, there's a headline there in terms of the difference in spread between false and true information. But you also pointed to something that the false posts had in common, and I'm wondering if you had a chance to also look at data coded according to emotional valence or according to the provocative nature of the posts, regardless of truth or veracity, to also maybe put a finer point on exactly that notion that information framed in particular ways, novelty really matters, emotional evocativeness matters as well. Is this something you've had a chance to look at or could be looking at more in the future?
Yeah, we didn't look at that because there's actually a rich literature that has already looked at exactly this question, especially when it comes to social media. There have been other works in the past that show that, for instance, novelty is a big factor, is a big predictor of whether something gets retweeted or not. And there was also research going back many decades before social media, people looking at news articles and looking at people sharing news articles and talking about news articles. And they also saw that there's definitely this emotional factor that not just that there's that emotional engagement makes people share something more, but actually, interestingly, they saw that negative emotion makes people want to share something more than positive emotion. And so, there is some, there's been work done in this area before. It's definitely something that, would be great as part of the future work, to look at exactly, like to quantify exactly how much these factors matter. But we didn't look at it because there was already some work done in this area.
Let me build on that, Sarush, as you and maybe Brian, because this is Media Impact Funders gathering people to have a voice here. Are there other questions, or would you elevate a certain aspect of your work, and Brian too, that you wish if funders could understand? As if you're in the crow's nest looking forward, seeing some of the key questions that we haven't been paying attention to, what might you prioritize for us as funders to be thinking about in terms of our investment? I ask that to both you, Sarush, and to Brian looking forward, because this space is changing rapidly. A lot of people are in it. A lot of funders are investing and putting different investments into the research aspect or other aspects too. But I just wonder how you might answer that.
I can go first if you don't mind. So I think there are two really important questions that need to be answered. Mm-hmm. One is everyone's looking at false information and fake news, and how much of it there is out there and who's consuming it. But there, as far as I know, there haven't actually been any studies that look at whether false information has an impact on what people believe and their behavior. Mm-hmm. So does it actually change people's voting behavior, for instance? Does it change any of their behavior, or is it just something that's spreading and not really having an effect? And I think that's an important question that needs to be addressed, because if you're investing so much research, so much money and time into trying to deal with this problem, you have to make sure that it's actually a problem that's that it actually is a problem. And it's a really hard question to answer because obviously it's hard to tie social media data with real world actions, right? So it's hard to look at people's voting behavior before and after they were exposed to misinformation and see if there was an effect. But I think that would be a really important area of research. And the second one would be if it turns out that misinformation does have an effect on people's behavior, then you need to obviously think of intervention strategies. And intervention could be either through policy or it could be through tech, through collaborating with platforms, working with journalists. There's so many education. There's so many different categories of intervention that could be worked on. But I think before people actually start working on these things, it's important to, or maybe not before, but maybe in parallel, it's important to also try to measure the impact of misinformation.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And I'll add just a couple of quick thoughts there. And I know we also have another question that came in that I'm also drawn to, so I want to make sure we get to that. But I think one of the challenges, actually, one of the opportunities, this might sound odd to frame it this way, but I actually think we need more work on public understanding of misinformation. What I mean by that is, if you were to ask people on the street, well, is this a good or bad thing to be spreading around? I don't think you'd have a lot of disagreement. And most people think that misinformation is something other than what they are regularly, trading in. And so that's something that's important, understanding how people see this. And I think that has implication for how we approach and frame and talk about what it is that we're trying to do. Because language matters, quite a bit, here. And I'll get to that maybe in just a second, with the question I think that came in. But in addition, I think that we need, in terms of folks that are at the table, behavioral science is an area that we could be drawing a little bit more directly on in terms of trying to understand how people make sense of information, what their motivation is for, certainly for sharing it, but trying to do so in a way that allows for the rational possibility of the types of behaviors that we are all worried about. And that's something that, again, goes back to that notion of respecting and understanding audience members as part of this. And I don't know that we've done that as much as we could. Some of that might be social, psychological. It could be a sociological approach. But I think understanding rationale and motive, and allowing for the possibility that this is not a us versus them, and this is not necessarily something that any of us is really immune to. I think there's a lot of work that could be done there, Elizabeth.
So I see that Brian is probably a big basketball fan down in North Carolina, so he's sort of throwing the ball up against the backboard so that he can dunk it in the next answer to the question.
Not anymore. It's been years.
Answer to there. Before he finishes his dunk, I do just want to put in a brief suggestion here that we're really respectful of the challenge of survey research and all of the work that goes into that. We ourselves are experiencing our own challenge of survey research. And so, brief advertisement. We'd like to invite everyone who's participating on this call to respond to our own survey about how we can better improve media impact funders. We're in the middle of a strategic planning process. I'm going to ask Sabira to put up the link to our survey, and I'm sure we're going to get 100% participation from a group that cares so deeply about the subject here. So with that advertisement behind us, Brian, I think most of you can see the question from Brooke Smith, but just paraphrasing it, she's wondering if maybe we're using the wrong language here in proposing this as a combat, as a fighting misinformation, always fighting. So, Brian.
So if you don't mind, I'm gonna quickly, I know we only have a few minutes here, but a couple of things. Because it's a relevant point, I want to channel some advice from my colleague Claire Wardell up at First Draft News, who has made a passionate case for us to avoid a phrase that I'm not going to utter, but that it has fake in the title, and there's reasons for that because of the implication for what that sets up in terms of a dynamic of opposition, perhaps to the news in ways that's really important and problematic. And so similarly, I think, this notion of a fight or a combat, it's easy for us to fall into that. I found myself, talking about things in that way, at times. But perhaps if we were to promote accuracy, and to try to, celebrate that as something that we could value, that we would frame it as being useful for all of us to move forward, that might be something. And also we have to prevent ourselves from stigmatizing or labeling somebody. If we're working against misinformation, you've ever trafficked in this, then you somehow are part of the side that we're working against. That's a real problem. So I really appreciated Brooke's comment. We don't have a lot of time to get into it necessarily here, but I think part of it is changing, perhaps, or really thinking creatively about how we're framing and talking about this.
And I think it sounds like we have a comment or question from Sally at the Trust Project as well. I wonder, on the other side of the question, how might we promote the spread of accurate information, particularly about science? Does the panel feel that an affirmative approach is also useful? I think this builds in what we're talking about here, but take it away. Brian.
Yes. Yes. As Sharush and Elizabeth might have thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. There's always limited attention. People have limited attention. And so if they are exposed to the false information first, their attention is oriented towards the false information. And even if they see the true information later on, it's unlikely that they might change their view. Whereas if they're actually shown the true information beforehand, before they're exposed to any of the falsity, I think they're more likely to just accept that. And so I think it is very important for science communicators to make sure that they're out there first before there's misinformation about what they're doing, so that people's attention is actually focused on the true information. And I think there are a few efforts around this. I don't know if you're familiar with what YouTube was doing a while back, where if you were watching something on YouTube that they deemed was spreading something that was false, they wouldn't say this is false. They would just say that, oh, there's this other source you should read, which is a legitimate, which is like respected outlet that has more to say about this. And the idea is that if you point them to that, without saying that what you're saying is false, they'll get the perspective of a respectful outlet, and so that they're hopefully less likely to believe the falsehood. So the short answer is yes.
Elizabeth, do you have a comment as well?
I will add to that. I think it's terrific. And I think there are some other resources we know, even when the work that Chris Volpe is doing on Science Counts, to even start testing different language helps us understand different ways to be talking about this. But I also want to put in a little promotional moment both for Brooke Smith, who will be moderating the webinar on Monday on how to support the scientists around communication. And there's a lot more work that's happening among Alan Alda, Compass, John Baisley, Anthony Dudo, and so forth, that the work that is coming forward that also will help us understand better how we can connect and communicate with different audiences. So thank you for just starting at an edge of this with some great experts, Sharush and Brian and Mint.
Yeah, and I would also just add that we're going to be returning to this subject in yet another webinar. Webinars are us this month. Actually, I think it'll be next month. We're going to be convening a discussion about recreating the public square. And we're going to be hearing from Eli Pariser, among others, in that presentation. I think we could share a link to that program as well. And I think that program builds on at least two talks that we've had recently at the last year or earlier this year at the Media Impact Forum here in Philadelphia. We had a bunch of really interesting presentations, but in particular, Ethan Zuckerman and Eli Pariser both talked about constructing this positive media ecosystem where all voices are heard, where they're not just the commercial platforms that are favoring those populations that are appealing to the best advertisers, but really represent and serve all communities. So I think there are some of the bad behavior flows from the incentives that advertising draws forward, right? The things that are most shareable are negative exchanges, which actually then drive revenue and advertising revenue. And so there's some bad incentives built into it. And I think Ethan and Eli were both talking about how can we construct a better world through platforms that actually serve the information that we want to see. So we'll be returning to that and in that program as well. So I want to thank you all. We're right about that time. If anybody has a final thought or an idea that you want to share, Brian, Sarush, Elizabeth.
Just let this not be the end of our discussion. We have a lot of work left to do. Yeah.
That's right. We will be continuing this in other webinars and other programming, and certainly share with us feedback about this discussion and all of our programs in the survey that we've invited you all to participate in. And thank you all for this lively discussion. Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you.